about addiction and reward and...
In addition to undermining our health, stress can make us feel plain miserable. Carol Shively set out to find out why. She began not with misery, but with pleasure. Shively suspected that there was a link between stress, pleasure, and where we stand on the social hierarchy. Just like stress, pleasure is linked to the chemistry of the brain. When a neurotransmitter called dopamine is released in the brain, it binds to receptors signaling pleasure. Shively used a PET scanner to examine the brain of a non-stressed primate. Our primate CEO.
What we see is that the brains of dominant monkeys light up bright with lots of dopamine binding in this area that's so important to reward and feeling pleasure about life.
Shively then looked at the subordinate's brain.
What we discovered is that the brains of the subordinate monkeys are very, very dull because there's much less receptor binding going on in this area. Why is that? What is it about this area of the brain? When you have less dopamine, everything around you that you would normally take pleasure in is less pleasurable. So the sun doesn't shine so bright, the grass is not so green, food doesn't taste as good. It's because of the way your brain is functioning that you're doing that, and your brain's functioning that way because you're low on the social status hierarchy.
One feature of low rank is being low ranking, the reality. An even stronger feature by the time you get to humans is not just being low ranking or poor, it's feeling low ranking or poor. And one of the best ways for society to make you feel like one of the have-nots is to rub your nose over and over and over again with what you don't have.
Richmond, California, a town where society's extremes can be spotted right from your car. This is cardiologist Jeffrey Ritterman's regular commute.
You can learn a lot about the stress and health outcome just from the neighborhoods you visit. In this neighborhood, the life expectancy is quite good, and most of the people are pretty healthy. And as we reach the top of the hill, it gets to be a little bit less privileged. And as we make this transition, the social status begins to drop, and correspondingly in those areas the health outcome is much worse. And these people are not going to have the same life expectancy as the people in the middle class area we started in. People are on guard, people are vigilant, they're living a more stressful life. This is a community that produces high stress hormones in people, and over time, it takes its toll.
All right, so that's getting us started into looking at how stress can impact dopamine levels and therefore impact addiction in the nucleus of accumbens that we'll talk about. So, what do we know about illicit drug use in the U.S.? Predominantly, it consists of marijuana, followed by prescription pain relievers. But you can see that the vast majority of the people who report having used illicit drugs, so about 10% of the U.S. population within the last month has reported this, and of that 10%, the vast majority of that is marijuana use, followed by prescription pain. What people are using those prescription drugs? Predominantly, it's your age group. It's 18 to 25. We see in the teens and older than 26 at about the same rates, but predominantly in that 18 to 25-year-old range is where most of the illicit drug use is happening. All right, so some terms and sort of definitions that we need to have straight before we can get into talking about this system. So tolerance, when we talk about tolerance, we're talking about reduced responsiveness to a drug that's based on the use of that drug. So because the person is chronically using a drug, the body becomes less sensitized to that, becomes desensitized, and therefore people need more of the drug to achieve the same effect. There's compensatory things that are happening within the body, both at a metabolism level and at a receptor level as well. So we get desensitization of receptors. There's also cognitive changes, so people become used to being under the influence of the drug. And as I mentioned, changes in metabolism that happen as well. So, for instance, in chronic alcohol use, one of the effects on the liver is that the liver starts making more of the acetaldehyde enzymes to break down the alcohol. So it starts generating more of the metabolism enzymes to handle the increased amount. So withdrawal then can be either physical or physiological or psychological, and this is what's going to happen after tolerance, after sufficient changes have occurred in the brain. Right? So that now, in absence of the drug, we get a negative effect. Right? We can have psychological dependence, where motivations and emotions have changed. We'll talk about decreases in activity in the frontal lobe, so frontal activity, and that then affects personality, emotion, motivational state, critical thinking, judgment, all of those sorts of things. Often, when you talk to addicts about their drug use, the common sort of theme that you'll hear from them is that they have to use the drug in order to feel normal, right? They're dependent on the drug to make them feel normal. They don't feel normal without using the drug. And then physiological dependence is where you're going to have reactions, withdrawal being one of those, from the body, where the body needs the drug in order to feel normal. And alcohol dependence can be really severe, and there are people that will actually have seizures or not be able to physically function without using alcohol. They can have such severe physical dependence that they have to be medically treated in order to not use the drug. They could actually die from the physiological dependence. All right, so the DSM-5 changed from the DSM-4 in terms of how it deals with diagnosing substance abuse. And so it's not called addiction or abuse, it's called substance use disorders. And they define that in 10 different classes of drugs. So these are the 10 different classes. They lump opioids, sedatives, hypnotics, and anxiolytics all together as one class. So they have 10 classes of drugs, and then they have 11 different symptoms. And you'll see, some of those you would be familiar with, like taking substance larger amounts for longer than you're meant to. That's tolerance, right? Or having to use more of the drug than previously. Cravings or urges, continuing to use even when it causes problems in relationships or interferes with your ability to work or go to school. And so these criteria, 1 through 11, are then subdivided into mild, moderate, and severe substance use disorder, depending on how many of these symptoms an individual exhibits. If they only have 2 to 3 of these symptoms, that would be considered, you'd be classified as mild substance use. If you had greater than 6 or more, then that would be severe substance use. All right, so what does this system consist of? Well, we have a natural reward system in terms of the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens that is going to be activated when good things happen, right? And for animals out in the wild, good things are going to be finding high food, high nutrients, or high caloric foods, right? And or finding a receptive mate. And so there's going to be some behavior, some seeking behavior. The animal's out looking for food. When they find that food, the nucleus of accumbens provides the reward signal, and then that triggers the limbic system, the amygdala in particular, and the hippocampus to form a memory of, okay, what was it that happened in the blue circle that led to the red circle getting activated? I'm going to remember that in the green circle so that I can do that again, right, and get that reward. And so this is a system that gets hijacked by drug use, because now the seeking behavior, the use of the drugs becomes conditioned, becomes a learned conditioned behavior, and the drugs are acting on the nucleus of accumbens to produce the reward. That's going to cause compensatory changes in the nucleus of accumbens so that this natural system's not going to work the way that it's supposed to in absence of the drug. And that's when we see the physical dependence. All right, so areas. The nucleus of accumbens is this reward center, addiction center. And it kind of acts in a backward way. Dopamine inhibits the nucleus of accumbens, and when the nucleus of accumbens is inhibited, that's when you have the pleasure signal. And that dopamine comes from the ventral tegmental area in the brainstem. And the opposite of that is glutamate from the frontal cortex, and glutamate's going to turn off the reward system. So we always want to be able to balance this system. And when the system gets out of balance because of drug use, that's when we start to see addiction and people having to use the drug just to feel normal again. All right, so almost all drugs then all addictive drugs act in some way, either a direct way on dopamine or through an indirect pathway to stimulate dopamine release in the nucleus of accumbens. So nicotine, for instance, acts on the ventral tegmental area. There are nicotinic receptors in the VTA that then stimulates the VTA to release dopamine. So it's like one step away. But nicotine, of course, is a very addictive substance. THC in marijuana acts directly to cause dopamine release, unlike nicotine. And so what are the things about this dopamine release that make drugs addictive? Two primary things. How rapid, how fast is the release of dopamine? The faster the release, the greater the reward signal. Right? And then how fast does it go away? The faster it goes away, the more frequently the person will need to use the drug. That's going to promote repetitive use of the drug. If we were to take the THC curve and plot it with nicotine, you would see that it's not that the rise time is not as great, and the peak is not as great on the stimulated release as nicotine is. All right. So let's see if we can hear Sapolsky loud enough to.
This monkey has been trained that when the little light comes on, it's one of those sessions where I can now get food, and it knows that if I press this lever 10 times, after a little bit of a delay, I'll get some food. If I press the lever 10 more times, I'll get some more food. It understands the task. So what do we have here? We have first a signal, the light coming on, saying it's one of those sessions. We're starting one of those. Then the monkey does the work, and then with a delay, it gets the reward. And what everyone initially thought was dopamine would go up after the reward. That's not when it goes up. It goes up when the signal comes on. What's this? This is the monkey there sitting and saying, I know this. I know the drill. I know this. I'm on top of this. This is going to be great. I know what I do now. This is completely perfect. 100% I'm going for today. Dopamine is not about pleasure. It's about the anticipation of pleasure. It's about the pursuit of happiness rather than happiness itself. And what's most remarkable is experimentally, if you block that rise of dopamine from occurring, you don't get the work. You don't get the behavior. This is not only the anticipation, but this is what is capable of eliciting goal-directed behavior. Amazing elaboration on this, which now begins to tell us something real familiar. Okay, so in this study, elaboration, rather than this design, you press the lever the right number of times, you get reward. Do the work, you get a reward 100% of the time. That's how it works. Now instead shift to where you get the reward only 50% of the time. You do the work, and only about half the time you get the reward. So what happens to dopamine levels there? This is what they do. They go through the roof. Because what have you just done? You've introduced the word maybe into the equation. And maybe is addictive like nothing else out there. Because the light comes on and you're doing the, I know how this works, this is going to be great, but I screwed up last time because I didn't get the food, but this time I'm feeling good today, but I'm a total screw up, and I'm inadequate in junior high school, and it was terrible, and but maybe this time this is my lucky day, and just vacillating all over the place. What we see here is dopamine comes pouring out like mad. It's the uncertainty of the reward. And here's the really elegant thing they did in that study. Now, instead of a 50% reward rate, either a 25% or 75%. These are diametrically opposite states. Worse news, better news, the only thing they have in common is you've decreased the level of unpredictability, and the rise in dopamine winds up being halfway between the 50% and the 100. And what's this about? This is the world of brilliant social engineering by humans, say, in Las Vegas, who understand how to design a place to take a curve where somebody has a gazillionth of 1% chance of getting a reward and making you think because it's this special day in this casino, and you especially are so much tilted to the right that you are going to get, and humans are profoundly manipulable in this realm. And it turns out, so are other species, the exact same neurochemistry. So what winds up being unique about us? And what you see is, with humans, it's the time dimension. You get the signal, you do the work, you get the reward. And the question becomes, how much time, lag time, can there be between the work and the reward to still elicit the behavior, to still get the work coming out? And we have just entered uniquely human terrain there for the very simple reason that probably most of us recognize, which is somewhere along the way, almost all of us worked very hard in school to get good SAT scores, to get into a good college, to get GREs, to get into a good grad school, to get a good job, to get in the nursing home of our choice there, sort of thing. And what we see is this astonishing ability of humans to keep those dopamine levels up for decades and decades waiting for the reward. And in the most bizarre, unique realm of this in humans, sometimes we could maintain it with a belief system where the reward doesn't come in our lifetime. The reward comes after our death. The reward comes in our afterlife. The reward comes unto the next generations. And there's no monkey out there who's willing to lever press all the time because of what St. Peter's going to think somewhere down the line. So that is unique about us.
All right. So this dopamine release then is not necessarily in response to the drug, although certainly drugs can stimulate dopamine release and cause reward, but the anticipation of the drug, so that seeking behavior, that dopamine becomes a motivating factor to go get the drug. So here we see several different drugs. We see that opiates act on GABA, which is then going to act through the ventral tegmental area to stimulate dopamine release. Opioids can also act directly to inhibit, like dopamine inhibits, the nucleus accumbens. We see effects of alcohol, nicotine. We see different ways in which cannabinoids act on this system, on either the ventral tegmental area or on the nucleus accumbens, right? So when we have the formation of addiction starting, the drugs are acting in some way to either decrease activity activity in the nucleus of accumbens or increase activity in the ventral tegmental area. On top of this, we also have plasticity in the amygdala, which is sort of not related to, or tied in as well to this system, right? And so in the amygdala, we're getting changes in the hedonic value of stimuli. And those stimuli are associated with drug seeking and drug use behavior. So here's pre-addiction state or control in an addicted brain. What do we know about the changes that have happened in the neurochemistry? And these changes are driven by the drug use. And so people say, well, how much drug use does it take to cause this? And that's highly individualistic. And it depends on your individual physiology, the sensitivity of your receptors, the plasticity in your brain. All of those things affect this. So no two people have the same amount of drug use that is going to trigger these changes. So it's difficult to predict what's safe drug use and what's going to lead to addiction. But what we see happening in the ventral tegmental area is we get upregulation of tyrosine hydroxylase, which is the enzyme to produce dopamine. So we're making more dopamine essentially. We get increased AMPA stimulation. So things that are normally going to stimulate the ventral tegmental area to cause dopamine release become more sensitive to that stimulation. We have decreases in the baseline dopamine. So the ventral tegmental area is normally releasing some baseline amount of dopamine in here. That level goes down, but the stimulated release in presence of the drug or in anticipation of the drug use goes up. In the nucleus of accumbens, we have a decrease in the frontal lobe's ability to act. So not only do we get decreases in glutamate from the frontal lobes, we get hypoactivity in the frontal lobes, but the receptors, the AMPA receptors, are downregulated in the nucleus of accumbens. And again, we get this decrease in baseline amounts of glutamate, but in absence of the drug now, we can actually get higher levels of glutamate, stimulated glutamate. And so when we have somebody that's going through withdrawal, part of the very negative affect of the withdrawal is this hyperactivity now, this increased glutamate turning off the reward center, denying the person the activity of that reward center. So when we have a drug that comes in and either blocks or overstimulates receptors, we get compensatory responses. So in the case that we have a drug that's coming in and blocking receptors, the brain's natural compensation is going to be to turn up more receptors there. If we're overstimulating the system, the brain's natural response is going to be to downregulate the receptors and to decrease the neurotransmitter itself. And in terms of antagonistic drug, we get increases in that neurotransmitter release. So the brain is set up to function in this normal way with feedback mechanisms to know how much synapses are being stimulated. And when we now throw an artificial stimulation, a drug, in the mix, we're acting on those natural plasticity systems to invoke these changes we see. So when we have decreases in those basal levels of dopamine and glutamate, we're getting dysregulation of this reward system. And so what are the behavioral effects going to be? Now we don't have enough activity in the nucleus of accumbens.
Cravings?
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're going to get cravings, and that's going to originate from the amygdala. And in the nucleus of accumbens, if we don't have enough dopamine that's being released naturally, right, what kind of behavior is that going to produce? Depression, right? It's going to decreases in positive emotions, right? And we get anhedonia, where things that normally should trigger this system no longer trigger this system. And in fact, we get changes in the amygdala where it's not even, those things aren't even valued in a positive affective way anymore. So initially, when substances are being used, there's a motivation to use that substance, right? So often with alcohol use, for instance, that motivation might be the either stress relief or relaxation or disinhibition that happens, becomes the motivation to use that. But at some point, as the brain begins to change and these changes occur, right, that positive reinforcement goes away and the negative reinforcement now has taken over. And so now, this is where the addict is saying, I used to use this for pleasure, but now I have to use it to keep from having these negative things happen, to get back to normal. We have changes in the frontal lobe that are happening at the same time, that hypoactivity of the frontal lobe. And while we have decreases in activity here, we get increases in corticotrophin releasing factor, norepinephrine, and dynorphin. I know we haven't talked much about dynorphin, but what are the behavioral effects if we get increases in CRF? What does CRF do? Stress, right? It's going to stimulate ACTH release and stimulate cortisol, increase stress response. What about norepinephrine? Yeah, so we get sympathetic nervous system activity. So a lot of the withdrawal effects are sweating, stomach doesn't feel good, racing heart rate. And in the brain, norepinephrine is going to cause the brain to become sort of hyperactive and fixate on wanting to get the drug and eliminating this, because they know if they now use the drug, that negative, all these negative things will go away, right? And dynorphin is actually the opposite of endorphins. And it actually can stimulate pain. So people can feel physical pain in response to this negative reinforcement system that's been turned on. All right, so speaking about the amygdala has, it actually has two layers, and it has reciprocal connections with the reward system, with the VTA. But it has two areas that are involved with either direct reinforcement or conditioned reinforcement, right? And so here's where we can talk about having direct drug effects or anticipatory or cognitive trained effects happening there. So learning conditioning is a key in this, and it's at the subconscious limbic system level. Nobody's sitting there thinking, oh, the car is where I always use my vape. And so every time I get in the car, I'm associating this environment with using the vape and getting the nicotine, right? That learning happens all subconsciously, so that now anytime you're in the presence of that environment, there's a strong craving or urge from the amygdala to have that drug present. And when you don't, then the negative reinforcement system kicks in, right? Lacking the executive control over this system, right, then by weakening the frontal lobes, and that makes it harder to control this. Remember last time we talked about with anxiety, the seesaw balance between the prefrontal lobe and the amygdala. And when we have hyperactivity in the amygdala, it's leading to those habits, it's leading to the cravings, the subconscious behavior. All right, so what causes the formation of addiction? Like I mentioned, we don't know, when does use become abuse and abuse becomes addiction is going to depend on each individual and their genetic susceptibilities, so anything associated broadly with these systems, right? How much dopamine metabolizing enzyme do you personally make? How many D2 receptors do you express, right? How much tyrosine hydroxylase enzyme are you making? All of those are individual genetic differences that we have, and they can change, and they can either make you more susceptible or have a preventative effect and make it harder for you to become addicted, depending on which way it goes. Certainly, the environment plays a role in motivating drug use, right? And we saw in the video clip about just being in a lower socioeconomic status, which we'll talk more about on Friday, increases your stress and also increases drug use. And in those lower socioeconomic environments, the availability of drugs is higher, right? You don't normally go into the high socioeconomic status neighborhood and see drug dealers hanging out on the street, where you could very well see that in very low socioeconomic status areas. And simply using drugs, a lot of drug use is self-medicating. There are people using drugs to escape from their problems, eliminate anxiety, eliminate stress. Lots of self-medication leads to this. So at some point, like we said, the positive reinforcement gives way to neuroadaptations that's going to lead to negative reinforcement. Right? And then for mood and emotion, we're getting changes in the nucleus accumbens and changes in the frontal lobe, such that now when every time they use the drug, they're returning, they've changed the set point and they're returning to this feeling of normalcy because the negative reinforcement system has been turned on. And that's really, when we get these changes, we get decreased reward, increased stress, increased arousal, increased pain, in absence of the drug. Right? That's what's going on here. That's what each of those things means. And that's when we go from this use to abuse to addiction stage. Driven by all of these changes, driven by the presence of the drug, right? The artificial stimulation of the drug on the system is molding, is causing the plasticity to happen. Right? All right, so once addiction's formed, why do people continue to use the drug? Well, this sense of normalcy, right? If they don't use the drug, they don't feel normal. They're not able to operate. They're not able to get out of bed. They're not able to do things. Often, in sort of that, when we don't have that severe addiction, people have to use the drug in order to continue functioning in society. Right? They get tremors if they don't have some alcohol first thing in the morning. Right? And the social stigma of addiction also continues to people trying to continue in it. Right? So we'll talk about therapy, but most drug treatment programs are going to involve detoxification, going to involve some inpatient treatment, and people have to go to their work and say, you need to let me have off for a month so I can go to rehab. That's a big social stigma. It's a big block to getting help sometimes. We have the subconscious learning and conditioning, the hypofrontality, and then the amygdala plasticity. So all of those changes that have happened in the brain because of the drug are now in play to promote continued drug use. So we have some really complex reasons to continue using the drug, and then we have some really neurologically based reasons to continue using the drug. And if we look in the brain of an addict, we can see those changes. And we see, this is someone that's addicted to cocaine. And here's our control. There's watching a nature video. We show them a video of somebody using cocaine, just seeing the act, seeing the drug. It triggers all of those cravings in the amygdala. This is the right amygdala here. And triggers activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, which is associated with emotion and negative emotion, right? So they get the cravings and they get sort of the withdrawal, the negative reinforcement effects, right? It can act so much to cause stress levels to increase by tenfold in response to seeing these drugs. The cravings trigger CRF release, which is then going to excite the body. And if you think about that, if the brain is trying, if the amygdala is trying to motivate the individual to do something, if they want to turn on the stress, that's the stress system. The stress system is our normal response to react to a challenge, right? And so the amygdala is seeing the not having the drug as a challenge and sort of hijacking that stress system. Now, the problem is that when people seek help, after they go through detox, after they get the drugs out of their system, these changes have happened in these brain areas, and they were driven to this changed state by the presence of the drug. And then we tell the addict, all right, well, be abstinent, don't use the drug, and hopefully things will go back to normal, but they don't always. And they certainly don't go back to normal in the sense that if that addict uses the drug, that this system is already sort of shaped to immediately bounce back into this changed state, even if it has reverted some back to a more normal state. Which is why people say, once you become addicted to something, that you're probably always going to be addicted at some level, meaning that if you try to use that drug at any level, your brain is going to swing back to this addicted state very rapidly. All right, so therapies. We talked about detoxification, usually inpatient, institutional, and then maintaining abstinence and hoping that the brain will slowly go back to this previous state, right? And so part of that, and there are some drug therapies, but part of trying to get this brain back to the pre-addictive state can be things like cognitive behavioral therapy, having to sort of relearn what are the natural things that should activate my reward system, right? And how can I learn to control those cravings and those thoughts, right? And recognize them, because often addicts will say that they'll be triggered by some cue that is part of that subconscious learning system. And so they'll be exposed to that cue and won't even know it, and all of a sudden they'll have this rush of thoughts about, well, I got to get the drug, I got to, the stress system becomes activated. So recognizing when that's happening, learning how to control that is an important part can be an important part of therapy. Group support is really important, can be very helpful in the abstinence. That's really the big positive effects of things like Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous, is that you can go get support from other people when you're feeling like not being abstinent, so helping promote the abstinence. All right, so there's sort of three different models that we talk about in terms of addiction. The disease model, meaning is there a physiological basis? Are there changes in the brain that have happened that promote continued use? Physical dependence, are there withdrawal effects? Are there negative reinforcement effects that the person is continuing to use the drug to avoid? And then positive reinforcement, is there a positive reason to use the drug? And this may be the initial reason why the addiction started, and then it may switch more into the negative reinforcement after the addiction is formed. And they're not mutually exclusive of each other. But it's important to understand how these work so that we can figure out treatment and prevention. Right? Drugs that have strong physical dependence, part of the treatment's going to be medical help and some institutional help. Right? Other drugs that don't have as much physical dependence, people don't usually need to go be institutionalized. All right, so in terms of alcoholism, if we apply this to those models, we don't have a drug treatment, right? So we talk about abstinence, and in terms of prevention, we know that alcoholism, particularly in males, can be hereditary. So recognizing that there's increased genetic risk to maybe limit exposure to alcohol. Physical dependence for alcohol, yes, there are significant withdrawal effects. And so having drug therapies to help alleviate those effects as the person detoxifies and that physical dependence is broken. And that usually takes a week to 2 weeks, sometimes even a month, depending on how severe it is. And so typically then people are going to be in treatment facilities, which are controlled, safe environments that are going to prevent them from relapsing because they can't get access to the drug while they're in the treatment facility. And then in terms of positive reinforcement, eliminating the positive effects. And with alcohol, there's a drug, antabuse, that inhibits the enzyme that breaks down acetaldehyde. So alcohol's metabolized in 2 steps. It's converted to acetaldehyde, which is toxic to our body, and then the liver takes acetaldehyde and converts it to acetic acid, which can be excreted by the bladder. So if you have an accumulation of acetaldehyde, it makes you feel very sick. And so this, instead of having to consume a large amount of alcohol to feel hungover and feel sick, someone that just has one drink can have that effect if they're taking the antabuse. There's been some use of antidepressant drugs to try and treat addiction. It's not really clear how effective those have been. This is an emerging drug therapy. So there's some new research.
Brain cells communicate with chemical messengers. One messenger is called dopamine. When brain cells release dopamine, it binds to the neighboring cell and produces a sensation of pleasure. Addictive drugs increase the amount of dopamine and produce a stronger pleasure signal, making the drug user want more. Chemical messengers from other brain cells regulate the action of the dopamine cells. By modifying these messengers, we hope to block the sensations of extreme pleasure produced by addictive drugs. Our target is a chemical messenger called GABA, which normally tells dopamine cells to slow down dopamine production. Inside the GABA cells, an enzyme called GABA transaminase, or GABA-T, normally binds to and disables GABA. By blocking GABA-T with a drug called vigabatrin, more GABA is left alone to send the stop signal.
And so
with this enhanced stop signal, less dopamine is produced even when an addictive drug is present, so the pleasure signal is blocked.
So this vigabatrin drug has been used in clinical trials to treat cocaine because cocaine acts so directly on dopamine release. And what they found is that it's helpful in preventing relapse, so that if someone does relapse and try to use cocaine, that it blocks the effects. They don't get the same rewarding effects that they would have gotten before. There's another drug, I'm blanking on the name of it, that does a similar thing with nicotine. It tries to block nicotine from getting across the blood-brain barrier. It acts in the peripheral body. Again, as a way to help prevent relapse. All right, and I know we're out of time here, but just to wrap up, our main treatment for addiction is abstinence. And depending on the drug, particularly legal drugs like nicotine and alcohol, because they're legal and so prevalent in society, it makes it very difficult for people that are addicted to those drugs to remain abstinent. It's a little bit easier for the illicit drugs that are harder to get a hold of because they're not constantly there. All right, talk about socioeconomic status. Please read that chapter before Friday because we're going to go over some of the Whitehall study things that Sapolsky talks about in there. It's really important that you have read that and have that background.